Coming up in this episode, we have Australia, Thailand, Cambodia, Vietnam, Chile, and Peru. But if you're interested in motorbikes, you'll just skip to the last 20 minutes when I actually buy a motorbike. So I'm back in Sydney and I'm itching to get into photography, particularly panoramic photography. I'd experimented a bit with it just with a tripod and a digital Pentax camera, and then I read about these GigaPan machines, only $500. The technology actually comes from NASA and the Martian landing probes when they took those series of mosaic photographs and stitched them together digitally, and the robotic head and the camera and all that. It's the same technology. My first few attempts around Sydney were a bit hit and miss. I really enjoyed it as a new hobby and I was getting better, but I was planning to head back to Bangkok. Things had settled down there and I knew I could get a very cheap room right on the river for only $5 or $6 a night with Wi-Fi, air conditioning, close to food. It was a nice quiet little street, the Riverline Guest House. And there I could knuckle down and finish the documentary that I'd been working on for years about Jane and John. There I also perfected my GigaPan technique. Here's one from the rooftop of the guest house of the river. I started getting better at it. It's not that difficult, but there is a few things you have to remember. This is the first one that I'm really happy about. 65 images, 200 megapixel of the river, and it's stitched together quite seamlessly. The Buddhist influence was still evident there. These nuns with their shaved heads were quite striking. They're very traditional attires, and of course the King of Thailand is still very well respected. So respected, in fact, that one Australian fell foul of the laws that say you cannot criticise the royal family. This guy was an English teacher. He self-published a novel that only sold 7 copies. He was surprised to find himself under arrest at the airport, unaware that 2 sentences in that book had offended the royal family, where they mentioned an unnamed prince. And the book was a work of fiction. Those huge aquatic lizards that live in the canals were still there. Speaking of lizards, I used to go to this place called the Gecko Bar to meet my friend Davide, who was still there after a year. Warren, the same agent I had offered him a work contract, but the visa was held up for over a year. He blamed bureaucratic bungling and incompetence in the Indian consulate in Italy. He filled in his time with a few small acting roles in Bangkok, like this one, and as he admitted, the bureaucratic bungling probably saved his life in view of what happened later in Mumbai.
But probably that saved my life, because if that year I wasn't in Thailand and I was in Mumbai, it was the year of the attack, and most probably that morning I will be sitting in Leopold Cafe, and probably I will get shooted in Leopold Cafe. So, that's life.
One day I went to have a haircut in the barber shop, and you'll notice there's a calendar there with the King of Thailand's face on it, and everybody's looking at the TV screen and ignoring me. So I went, any chance of a haircut? And a guy turned around and said in broken English, can you come back in a few hours? We're watching the royal wedding. So William and Kate's royal wedding was in the news for weeks afterwards in Thailand. They respect all royalty, not just their own, because they're all one family, the way the Thais say it. They're very traditional. Hey Davide, give me a kiss like the Italian men do.
Hey, vattene.
But only a few days later, something else grabbed the headlines. I came out of my room in the guest house and a man in the street came up and shook my hand and in broken English said something about Osama bin Laden, killed, well done. He thought I was American. And I was in that film about Osama bin Laden called Daddy bin Laden. So I pick up a newspaper and there it is, confirmed he was living in Pakistan all along. People in Bangkok are very proud of their Thai culture, but they also have a fascination for Western culture. Look at who was touring in Bangkok when I was there. Look at this old Packard convertible. And mind you, it must be an American model because the steering wheel is on the other side. In Thailand, they drive like in Australia with the steering wheel on the right-hand side. One night I saw all these black BMWs lined up outside a cafe. I don't know who owns them, but I heard a rumour that a wealthy businessman collector owned every single one of those bikes. But there was no mystery as to who owned this very well-travelled Africa twin. Looking around, it had Argentine number plates. There was this map that indicated they'd done 72 countries and 210,000 kilometres, and they'd been on the road for 9 years. They were making a little bit of side money by charging passers-by to get their photo taken with them and the bike. But of course, hardly anybody speaks Spanish in Thailand, and they were quite elated when I sort of helped them translate a few of the requests. And when I said to them, "¿Qué quieres para cenar?" and bought them dinner, we sort of had a bit of camaraderie there. They travelled with a little pet dog, and in 2008 they were detained in Georgia trying to cross into Turkey. After I met them there in 2011, Julian and Lorena, they continued for another 9 years. They even had a child on the road, and they did another 220,000 kilometres. In fact, it's now April 2021. We're 1 year into the pandemic, and they are still on the road, holed up in Guatemala, and it's looking very likely their trip will last 20 years on the bike. Che Guevara would have been proud of his fellow Argentines.
Bien hecho, Julian y Lorena.
But that Argentine African twin wasn't the only long-haul vehicle I saw in downtown Bangkok. This old school bus had been converted by a British guy and driven all the way from England on chip oil, like biodiesel vegetable oil. And he had something in common with the previous couple, because when he crossed from Pakistan into India, he was arrested by the police and thrown in jail, because the Indian Army had homed in on his satellite phone, which he didn't know was illegal. He was later released, but he was inadvertently drawn into this net of political tension between India and Pakistan, especially when you consider how David Headley was white. He went ahead and did reconnaissance, and that's why the police picked him up just inside the Indian-Pakistan border. I almost got picked up by the police shooting this GigaPan of this historic river fort. A man in hippie clothes and long hair, earring, started pestering me. What was I doing? Why was I taking the photo? I didn't really understand his accent, and I started packing up. And then he jumped in front of me and produced a police badge. He was an undercover policeman, and he took my passport details and then let me go. Speaking of the police, check out this sign for the Bangkok police force. The man standing there is George Sotirios. He's a journalist friend of mine from Australia who'd just come back from a big trip around South America, and he wrote a very successful book about it. I also met up with another friend, John here. He was a colleague in my teaching days in Cartagena, and he was also a bike nut. So he took me along to see the Bangkok annual Bike Expo, which was held in a multi-storey shopping mall. John liked the modern models. I liked the vintage models. But we both liked the Thai models. There were some interesting models parked outside as well. Compared to when I was in India, time passed really quickly when I was in Bangkok. Pretty soon my visa ran out and I decided to do a visa run to Laos, and there's a whole industry that's sprung up servicing these visa runs. So I paid my money and I stood on a minibus to Vientiane, the capital of Laos. It was an interesting bunch of people. There were Americans, Spanish, Colombians, but mainly there were Filipino girls. These Filipino girls all worked in a Japanese restaurant in Bangkok, and they were accompanied by their own minder, because apparently sometimes they do runners, because they said to me, and they complained a lot, that they were treated like slaves in this restaurant. Now, I actually dated one of the prettier ones here, but I could hardly see her because her hours were so long. She was so tired that she was too tired to see me half the time, and she only got like 1 day off every 2 weeks, and she needed that to go shopping and blah blah blah. In fact, one of the girls told me they only worked there in the hope that they would catch a rich Japanese or Korean businessman as a husband. I actually heard later on that 2 of the girls on this visa run quit as soon as they got back to Bangkok and ran away from the house and provided accommodation because they didn't like being treated like slaves. Back in Bangkok, I finally finished my 2-hour documentary after many years of work, Aussies in the Andes. Time for a Thai banquet to celebrate? No. No, I wanted to explore a little bit of Southeast Asia, Cambodia, Vietnam, and then go back to South America. So I was on a bus from Bangkok to Siem Reap in Cambodia. At the border, there was a lot of con men hanging around trying to help me, but I didn't really need their help. And in the actual immigration booth, they take your fingerprint and a photograph of you. I think it's a little bit like Central American countries. These super poor countries seem to be a magnet, a mecca for people that might be on the run. And this is the last chance for law and order to catch up with them with a fingerprint and a photo at the border. This was my hotel, only $5 a night, including air conditioning, and you need it here. They arranged a young tuk-tuk driver for me who was quite honest, which according to this sign is a rarity in these parts. Cambodia is a poor country still suffering the effects of war, but they get on with life and make do with what they have. Many people ride bicycles, and look what they've done with these old truck tyres, very ingenious. They don't waste anything. This handbag factory not only uses crocodile leather, but snake skin and stingray skin. Like the Thais, Cambodians have a deep respect for their royal family, and their queen to me looks a little bit like a younger Queen Elizabeth II. This is a Cambodian police patrol bike. Look how heavy that trailer is, and it's being pulled by a small capacity bike. You have to wonder, the brakes, the chain, the clutch, all the momentum, if that thing's full, if you've got to hit the brakes, how do they pull such an immense weight and still remain safe? Quite common are these tuk-tuks that have an articulated carriage that can carry up to 4 adults. Armed with a 7-day pass, I could visit all the ruins, and I had a chauffeur in the form of this 3-wheel chariot. The main ruin is very close to town. I went in a tuk-tuk, and along the way we saw this travelling tool salesman. I soon had a lot of fun immersing myself in taking GigaPans. At many of the outer ruins, there were just jumbles of these moss-coloured stone blocks waiting for the archaeologists to reconstruct the sites. Unfortunately, much of the statuary was damaged by looters or the ravages of time. You have to admire the ancient stonemasons for labouring in such hot tropical conditions, where there's spiders, insects, fungus lurking in every corner. At one of the temples, this man came up on a bicycle that looked about 100 years old. It was covered in mud. He chatted to me in broken English, thick German accent. He was from the former East Germany, and he said, "I normally ride 2,000 kilometres, but I'm getting old and, I can only ride a little bit. I only came from Thailand." And then he lifted up his shirt and showed a huge red scar that looked fairly fresh. And he said, "They tell me I have cancer and I will die, but I want to live. I want to ride my bicycle till I die." And wow, what an inspiration. What a tough old guy. This is the Temple of Ta Prohm, made famous by Angelina Jolie in the Tomb Raider movie. And I can tell you it had an eerie ambience, and not just because of these massive tree roots which seemed to flow like a waterfall over the stone building, silent except for the occasional tropical bird call. The whole scenario was just surreal. This is the other side of the same building. The detail is just amazing. This is a view from a high tower in the main Angkor Wat complex. The details in these carvings is just amazing. But other tourists seem to have an even higher viewpoint. But not to be outdone, I decided to go over their heads.
I'd heard about Microlite joy flights over the ruins, but as always, getting to the destination, in this case the aerodrome, was almost as interesting as the flight itself. Necessity is always the mother of invention. That looks like a homemade cargo sidecar with a bespoke shock absorber system. People here are ingenious, but they do seem to take risks. Look at this, 12 people and 2 motorbikes in the back of a small ute. Well, I'm not going up in this single-seater. It's a Microlite with a Rotax engine. Some motorbikes use Rotax engines. like KTM, BMW, Aprilia. These microlights are basically powered hang gliders. This is our two-seater. It has a rear-mounted push propeller. It's also got a Rotax engine. Rotax engines have a very good reputation, regarded as one of the most reliable engine makes in the world.
Which is quite important when you consider that the farmlands around Siem Reap are still covered with thousands upon thousands of unexploded landmines. So gliding to an emergency landing is not as safe as you would think, especially since they tend to descend very quickly compared to other aircraft.
If the engine cuts out when you're up there, does it
Glides
glide?
12 to 1. 12 to 1. Comes down 1 and goes forward 12.
That's not a great ratio, is it?
Not great. It's the best one of these.
Yeah.
That's this type.
Yeah.
But no, Cessna, the 150s I started in, they'll do 15 to 1. Some of the bigger planes do 20, 25. A sailplane, the newest ones, they'll do 50 to 1.
Right.
These are what they use in go-karts, don't they? Rotax.
They use them in all sorts of
'Cause they're lightweight.
Snowmobiles, jet skis.
At certain times of the year, this whole plain is flooded with river water. Here you can see how the main palaces were surrounded by moats, which would have been dug out by hand in the ancient times. That looks like a giant artificial lake in the background there. The pilot steered by leaning on this control bar, which basically just tilts the single wing like a hang glider. Our maximum altitude today was 532 metres. Eddie the pilot pointed out some ruins on this hill, and I made a mental note to visit them later on. That looks interesting. Unfortunately, bad weather forced us to turn back early, but it was still a once-in-a-lifetime trip that I'll never forget.
That temple of Phnom Krom is situated on the only hill for miles around, about 12 kilometres southwest of Siem Reap. Access is via these ornate steps and an even more ornate mezzanine landing. Onwards and upwards, and this is the magnificent Hindu temple built around the year 900 AD. This hill has always had a great strategic value. It overlooks Tonle Sap, which is the largest freshwater lake in all of Southeast Asia. The lake swells and shrinks according to the monsoon rains. And if you had been here in the year 1177, you would have seen a huge naval battle. The protagonists were the Khmers from Cambodia and the Champas, who came from what is now southern Vietnam. You can see the Champa battle vessel depicted in this relief carving that's in another temple called Bayon. The Champas actually won and executed the king of Angkor Wat. Another curious thing, this is actually a crematorium. You can see there's an infant, then there's an adolescent, and then there's an old man hobbling along with a walking stick. And then there's a dog pulling at a skeleton right at the very entrance to the furnace oven, as if it's a reminder we're all going to end up there one day. Cambodians are just as apprehensive about things like cemeteries and crematoriums as we are. My tuk-tuk driver didn't want to leave his tuk-tuk and walk around with me and have a closer look. He said it gave him the creeps. In Yet the kids that lived around there, they didn't seem to mind. They happily posed on these tombstones for me, and just look at how normal and well-adjusted kids they are. Like kids everywhere.
Hello? What?
Though Angkor Wat and Phnom Krom were Hindu temples when they were built, at the height of its power, Angkor Wat converted to Buddhism. And the result is today more than 97% of Cambodians are Buddhists. And this is despite the genocidal campaign in the 1970s of the Khmer Rouge, whose number one targets were foreigners, intellectuals and Buddhist monks. And to my eyes, Buddhism is much more integrated to the daily life of the people than, say, Christianity is in my own country. You see modern functioning Buddhist temples next to ancient 1,000-year-old temples. You see Buddhist monks walking around everywhere. Their modern temples like this one are just absolutely beautiful pieces of art. I think these paintings relate to scenes of the Buddha's life. Historians say Angkor Wat at its peak was the largest city in the pre-industrial world, with around 1 million inhabitants and an area comparable to that of modern-day Los Angeles. Nobody's 100% sure why the city went into slow decline, but eventually, after a few centuries, the jungle started to take over. But these lands would come to prominence again in history books in the 1970s, 80s, 90s, with a series of 20th century wars that devastated the country. To learn more about that, I went to the local war museum. Rather than going into great detail about the 20th century wars that troubled Cambodia, I've just sort of skimmed through Wikipedia and put the major points that caught my attention, and I'll just scroll them past the screen along with all the shots I took in that museum. It's very, very sad. Cambodia is carpeted with landmines and unexploded ordnance. Some estimates range up to 10 million of them still lying buried in the ground. They pose a huge threat to children and agricultural workers, and it will take decades to resolve at the current rate of landmine clearing. They are the product of 3 decades of war. But incredibly, not all landmines were placed as a result of war. Some of them were laid in a circle around major ruins like Angkor Wat at sunset and gathered up in the morning. They were put there to deter looters and even Khmer Rouge guerrillas who would steal ancient statues and sell them on the black market for thousands of dollars. Cambodia only has a small population, but it has around 40,000 amputees. Despite national and international efforts to educate people not to go near these unexploded bombs, people still do. Fishermen use them for blast fishing, often have accidents. It's in this report that children throw them into bonfires to have a kind of deadly fireworks display. And another problem is scrap metal dealers that travel from village to village and pay just a pittance to some children for the scrap metal value of these unexploded bombs. A few years after I left, a Belgian NGO pioneered the use of giant African rats to sniff out the bombs. Apparently they were safer, cheaper and quicker than using humans or sniffer dogs to find the bombs.
So
All these landmines mean many ruins are still sort of unapproachable. One road had just opened up to a huge complex, the old capital before it was Angkor Wat, which was Ko Ker. So I went out there on a little tour, and that was interesting. In this area there's over 180 known temples, but when I was there in 2011 you still couldn't go to most of them because of the landmines. This temple's called Prasat Kachap, but it's also known as the Temple of the Inscriptions. You can see there's writing in Sanskrit, and it dates the temple to the year 928, and it even lists the names of all the slaves who were press-ganged into building this temple over 1,000 years ago. There were numerous temples on this circuit. Some of them were ruined, some of them were in very good condition, like this one. It still had its Shiva Linga or Hindu phallic icon still in the middle there. You can see it in the interior. Ko Ker pyramid itself faces a ruin with the unlikely name of Tomb of the White Elephant. On the other side there's an artificial lake that still has water in it. And this passageway of broken columns facing this ornate doorway. I went there with just one other tourist, and it really felt like we were Indiana Jones walking through some undiscovered ruin. Over 1,000 years old, but look how ornate and well preserved it is. And then the pyramid itself comes into view. How stunning it was. 7 levels. Absolutely monumental. There were wooden steps there, but it didn't look like it was a good idea to climb up them. How many slaves died building this, you can only wonder. As soon as I saw it, I thought, this looks like a Central American, a Mayan or an Aztec pyramid. And the internet is full of theories saying that they were in contact, blah blah blah. And then there is this other pyramid, also in Angkor Wat, that looks very, very similar to Tikal in Guatemala. But those two similar pyramids are different in size. They're built more than 2 centuries apart and separated by more than 16,000 kilometers of open Pacific Ocean. I think the answer is pretty simple, and I'll get to that in a minute. On the way back, we stopped at yet another gigantic ruined complex. The huge blocks here were covered in moss. They lay around jumbled and looked like, some giant had kicked a box of Lego blocks. They were just all jumbled everywhere, covered in green moss. This makes you wonder, where did these Angkor Wat people get their wealth from? Well, there is a surprising document written by a Chinese envoy called Zhou Daguan. He was an envoy sent from China by Kublai Khan's grandson, and his record survives in Chinese, and it's been translated to say some fascinating things. One of the reasons the Angkor Wat Empire was so rich was it had a lot of gold. Describing a royal procession of one of the kings, the women wore silver and gold. Carts drawn by goats and horses were all in gold, and even the elephant's tusks were encased in gold. This is Bayon Temple, and Zhou Daguan said the central tower was covered in gold when he saw it. It's important to remember that Zhou Daguan was a contemporary of Marco Polo, and he was writing about the twilight years of Angkor Wat, when it was in decline. The Angkor king was born on a golden palanquin to a golden pagoda where there was a golden Buddha statue. Another thing he noted in some detail was the collection of human gall-bladders. He wrote that a giant jar was filled with thousands upon thousands of human gall-bladders, and this jar was sent as a tribute to the king of the Chambers, who live in what is now southern Vietnam. He wrote there were guards stationed around the city, and they would fall upon anyone out at night and remove their gallbladders with a knife. And if that sounds unbelievable, you have to remember, still today in Chinese medicine, bear bile extracted from caged bears is still practiced. This temple here was quite small, but it immediately grabbed my attention from far away. I was there on the 1st of June, around about midday, and a shaft of sunlight illuminated the relief inside the tower, as you can see there. Now if you look at that on Google Earth, those towers form a perfect north-south line. I got online and calculated the angle of the sun was almost directly overhead, 99 degrees. But I don't know whether it originally had a roof. But if it didn't, then there is an interesting parallel across the Pacific Ocean over there in Ecuador, in Cayembe. Over there, the people also built simple vertical walled structures, in this case a circular wall, to observe the equinoxes and the solstices. And a very famous Spanish scientist called Antonio de Ulloa did a drawing of it. It doesn't exist anymore, but he was amazed it had lasted so many centuries, and it was made from blocks of something called concagua, which is something they dig out of the ground in Ecuador, let it dry in the sun, and it turns hard like a brick. Now that brings me to another parallel, which would bring me right back to Cambodia, where they dig something out of the ground, laterite, and they let that dry in the sun, and that becomes hard as a rock as well. In fact, they still do it today. You can see them there drying these blocks in the sun. Another uncanny thing, have a look at the stonemasonry here. This is in Cambodia, but it does look a lot like Inca stonemasonry. So, is there a connection between these two cultures? It would appear so, but appearances can be deceptive. I don't think there's enough evidence to say that they were connected telepathically or by UFOs or whatever, or even just by, sailing ship. The evidence is not there. But there's plenty of evidence for a theory called simultaneous discovery or multiple discovery. Wikipedia's got its own page on it. And when you look at the list of things that are much more advanced than building a pyramid, that were also discovered simultaneously or totally apart at different periods in time. I mean, you look at this list of multiple parallel discoveries, people working apart, discovering the same thing but independently. There's calculus, there's the theory of evolution. I mean, the list goes on. And it also includes the discovery of platinum by the aforementioned Antonio de Ulloa and another guy in England. You've got to give ancient people some credit here. They were smart people. They could arrive at a solution and solve a problem without communicating with people across the other side of the world. Speaking of smart people, I saw this sign advertising a pub quiz at Siem Reap's warehouse pub. I went along, introduced myself, joined this team, and we won second prize. With a lot of help from the guy in the white t-shirt. Bill Carr was pretty knowledgeable. He wrote a biography on William Adams, the first Englishman and one of the few foreigners to ever become a shogun. In fact, a few decades ago, there was a best-selling book and a very popular mini-series called Shogun, based on the life story of William Adams. A few weeks later, I was on a three-man team with this British and French couple, and we won first prize, much to the bewilderment of bigger teams and the American quizmaster, who just shook his head in disbelief.
We are the champions.
I could have stayed a lot longer in Siem Reap. It wasn't just the multitude of ruins, the friendly people, the ingenuity of the locals. It was as if no matter where you looked, you saw something different, something interesting. But it was time to leave. I wanted to see Phnom Penh, the capital. There I fell in love with this beautiful Khmer girl. But I don't want to talk about that. Unfortunately, my visa was running out and I had to make a run for Vietnam, to Saigon. Along the way, we saw again these overcrowded people transports and what I think was a fatal accident. I hope it wasn't. Thankfully, I arrived safely in Saigon, which these days is known as Ho Chi Minh City. So Ho Chi Minh City is situated on the Saigon River just before it enters the sea. My hostel was more or less in the middle of town and it was only $12 a night. Like many countries in Southeast Asia, two-wheelers are ubiquitous and they're often overloaded. I was only there for a few weeks, but you could tell it was a mixing pot of different cultures, from the architecture, from little clues like the type of vehicles on the road, like this classic BMW parked in front of a KFC. This looks like a rip-off of Dunkin' Donuts, and this looks like a poor imitation of McDonald's. Never expected to see a left-hand drive Mini Moke here. Here we have three Soviet-made Minsk 2-stroke 125s. Very popular in Vietnam, and you might remember Richard Hammond rode a pink one in an episode of Top Gear. Yeah, in Ho Chi Minh City, two-wheelers definitely are the way to get around, and the occasional three-wheeler. This sign encourages family planning. This is a distinctly Asian way of taking a load off your legs. At that time, there were very few Vietnamese panoramas on the GigaPan server. So I hired a motorcycle taxi and he took me around to some local landmarks. But first we stopped and bought a face mask, and this was 10 years before COVID. Filled up with gas and ready to roll. This is a Vietnamese hearse. I don't know what the ultimate fate of these poor dogs was, but it didn't look too bright to me. This is a Cao Dai temple. Cao Daists are like a mixture of several religions. It has a papal hierarchy. It mixes Taoism, Buddhism, Christianity, and the teachings of Confucius. A real hybrid religion, and it's only really popular in Vietnam. The religion began in the 1920s in Vietnam. Among its three main saints is Victor Hugo, the French author who wrote Les Miserables and The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Now, if the outside looks very different, the inside was very different too. Chanting and drums, men and women separated, and it was just unlike anything I've ever seen before or since. I was very intrigued by these Cao Dai temples, and I found out there were a few others scattered around the outskirts of Ho Chi Minh City. I wanted to do a few more GigaPans of them. So I hired another motorbike taxi and we went to this one at Trang Bang. This Cao Dai temple isn't half as big or in the same optimum condition as the main temple, but it will always live on in history for the tragic events that happened right in front of it in 1972. Everybody's seen this tragic, harrowing photo of children running away from a napalm attack. The little girl's name was Kim Phuc, and she joined a bunch of adults that had taken refuge in this temple and were running for their lives when they realised they were about to be bombed. I remember seeing the video on TV in Australia and my mother just almost bursting into tears. How can people do this to children? It's a miracle that that girl lived. She suffered many years of agony and skin grafts. The photographer took her to the hospital and she was not expected to live. I was 10 years old when I saw that on TV in Australia. She was 9 years old. And at that time Australia still had troops in Vietnam, although they were in the process of withdrawal. It's alleged that Richard Nixon at first thought it was a fake photograph. To me, it's ingrained in my head as an absolutely shocking event in world history. But when I was there in 2011, it was quiet, peaceful, friendly. I guess that's the way it should be, but it's people should never forget what happens in wars. A bit further on, there was another Cao Dai temple. And right out the front in the same street, they had these two signs. This is a sign warning of the dangers of human trafficking. And this sign says, "Turn your back on drugs." I never expected to see this, a paddock full of huge animal statues, and one of the Statue of Liberty. You see, this street sign here celebrates Louis Pasteur, and that reflects the fact that France controlled Vietnam and Indochina for around 100 years. In fact, after World War II, it was the French who asked the Americans for help in controlling a political situation, and that escalated into the Vietnam War. You can definitely see the French influence in the architecture of these buildings that they left behind. This is the main post office, and this is its interior. The man in the photo is Ho Chi Minh. I heard a tourist guide describe him as country father. I think what they were trying to say was he's the father of the nation. But he actually died before the end of the war. But he was the communist leader and they ultimately won the war. In some parts of the city, it looked like Hong Kong might have looked 20 years ago. But in other parts, it looks extremely modern. Now this is Ho Chi Minh City from the other side of the river. And doesn't it look like a brand new Western city in the United States? But politically, at least, it's still communist. On the river you can see these old boats, but you can also see remnants of the US involvement in the Vietnam War, which Vietnamese call the American War, because they've had numerous wars with China and other countries, so they call it the American War. And American culture lives on, not just in Kentucky Fried Chicken, but places like this art gallery, where they copy the old masters, but they also do painted copies of famous photographs, magazine covers, etc. Quite a mishmash of themes, actually. I stayed quite a while in Saigon, but unfortunately I don't have much video because at one of the airports when I left. It was either Ho Chi Minh City, Melbourne or Sydney. The baggage handlers did something, dropped my bag, I don't know, got squashed between machines. Because when I got home, my video camera and my GigaPan machine were both broken. And it took a long time and a lot of emails back and forth, but eventually I got compensated. I only had a couple of weeks in Sydney seeing friends and family, but I was able to buy a new GigaPan machine and a new video camera, and I went from digital tape to memory card. So my plan was fly over to South America one more time, show the film about Jane and John, and maybe buy a motorbike and do a 1 year trip. I actually had a 10 or 11 month return ticket, and I thought that would be enough. 10 months to do 10,000 kilometers, I thought that would be pretty easy. That's only 1,000 kilometers a month, 250 kilometers a week. That's nothing. It should be easy to do, right? Wrong. So I was finally on a flight to Santiago de Chile via Auckland, New Zealand, where they sold rugby books in the waiting lounge. Overnight flight, arriving the same day because we crossed the international date line. Ensconced in the Santiago suburb of Topolaba, I took a few gigapans of Santiago's beautiful architecture. I also took time to look at motorbikes. I hadn't heard of these Chinese brands of motorbikes, but they appeared to be well made. The key word here is appeared. This is a poster for Rise of the Planet of the Apes, and it says the future is here and we are not in it. I think these posters are advertising folkloric music performances. The graffiti at the bottom says the earth isn't dying, it's being assassinated. Zapatista, Guevarist, indigenous resistance slogans are quite conspicuous all across Santiago and Chile in general. This is a protest I saw on my first day outside the National Library of Chile. And there was more than a few motorcycle police keeping an eye on them. But I only stayed 3 days in Santiago, and I was on that long bus ride more than 2,000 kilometers north. Stopped over in sunny Arica at the border and stayed at Sunny Days Hostel once again. It's tropical here, but it's hot and dry because of the Atacama Desert. Many of the historic buildings look like they've just been baked in an oven. Here too, Chile's political posters abound along with beautiful architecture. And curious street signs. This mural was done by school students and has an anti-smoking theme. Then the final bus ride from the Pacific coast up to Cusco in the Andes, 3,400 meters above sea level. So I'm ensconced in the Hostel La Estrelita, my home away from home, where bikes and bikers are always welcome, and even the occasional feathered friend.
I like the tuk-tuk.
I headed straight for the Cross Keys pub. It was a British pub, as you can see, owned by a very British gentleman, Barry Walker MBE, who kindly lent his establishment to me to show the world premiere of Aussies in the Andes. It was publicised by the South American Explorers Club, and about 25 or 30 people turned up. Quite successful, we couldn't really fit any more in. Here are the main protagonists. You might recognise the guy on the right with the beard, that's my friend Christo. A few days later, he helped me do something else that was on my bucket list, which was to go on a bike ride. He hadn't been on a motorbike before, and I hadn't been on a bike much either. When I was a teenager, I had this little two-stroke Suzuki commuter bike, and although I still had a current rider's license, I hadn't ridden a motorbike much in the last, since I was 20 years old. So a refresher lesson was well in order. The instructor took us up the back hills to the north and northwest of Cusco, up behind Sacsayhuaman. At first they took us to this open patch where we just did like loops, circles, and we got the hang of the clutch, the brake, the accelerator. It started to come back to me. Then we did a few longer runs. There's some nice views up there. We had a great time. It was great fun. Back in La Estrelita, a German couple arrived on this custom-made BMW motorbike with a sidecar. The owners were Annette and Kai. And Kai was a motorcycle mechanic, and he built this bike about 20 years ago, and it was called Angkor, which was an acronym of their first and second names. They'd already been to many places around the world, including Australia. It's based on a BMW R Series flat twin. Kai said these days it would not be legally possible to build such a bike. Not cheaply anyway, but when he did it 20 years ago, it was legal, and he's maintained the registration, and he's able to keep riding it legally in Germany. Now, there's a lot of modification went into this. The rear wheel, look how wide it is. It's off a Volkswagen. And he beefed everything up, made it all stronger, especially the front suspension, steering, forks. But, you know, it's something that he built himself with his own hands. You see this poster in front of Jack's Cafe, and it was also on the side of this van that was touring all around the back streets of Cusco. A nightmare circus, because Halloween was upon us. It borrowed a lot from the Rocky Horror Show. It was pretty good, getting attacked by these beautiful zombie women. But I wasn't drinking, because the next day was a Sunday and I booked myself a motorcycle tour, a long one, out to Ollantaytambo, a big loop, and back. It was up and down. It was good to get back into the saddle after so many decades of not really riding a motorbike at high speed. At a couple of points there, we touched 100 kilometres an hour in the straight stretches. A lot of it was on the back roads. My guide was Angelo. He was a motorcycle mechanic. Here you can see us filling up. We're on the same Honda 250s that I'd done the lesson with Christo on. You can see this here, there's a huge landslide. That happened the year before, and it cut the rail link that takes all the tourists to Machu Picchu, and you can only get there by rail or a very long hike. For 2 months it was cut, and they had to fly them out by helicopter in the end. It did look like a good rain would bring it all down again. So you can see there they had a bulldozer parked there, ready to push away any further falls. So I really enjoyed being off-road, and you go around a corner here and you feel like you've stepped back in time sometimes. Yahoo! I was really enjoying these spectacular canyons. Everything was going well. Then, a reality check. We're already back in town, done 142 kilometres, and only 500 metres from dropping the bike off at the rental depot. So I was travelling down Avenida de la Raza. It was a little bit steep. It was cobblestones. It wasn't raining, but there was a little bit of water coming out of a drain. And I was following a truck, and I was only going about 10 kilometres an hour. We were in traffic, basically. I gave it a bit of brake, and it slipped on the wet stones. I gave it a bit more brake, and then we hit the dry. And it was a combination of the wet conditions, me not recognising it's dangerous, and my inexperience with the front brake. The front brake then gripped on the dry, and it felt like someone just took the steering wheel out of my hands. I really did feel like a ghost or something had taken it. And I fell on my side, on my right side. The bike fell on my leg. I jumped straight back up. I was all right. There was a little bit of damage to the bike, about $30 worth. Rode it back to the rental place. Then caught a taxi back to La Estrelita. And I found it hard to get out of the taxi because my hip was hurting. Now, by the time I got into the Estrelita, I needed help to walk up the steps to my room. In the morning, I was in such agony I had to crawl to go to the toilet. But only if I put weight on my left leg, on the hip socket. This was the first time in my life I'd been sort of crippled, couldn't walk. I was worried I might need surgery, I might be permanently incapacitated. By now I was starting to worry and a little bit panic. I called the rental place because I did have insurance when I rented the bike, but the lady said it's too late to make a claim. You have to make the claim before you hand the bike in. So my mind started panicking, going into overdrive. First thing, food. I couldn't cook, I couldn't walk to the shop to buy food. So I called my friend Jane from Jack's Cafe, who very kindly hand-delivered beautiful meals at cost price. Next thing I needed was medical attention, and she reminded me that our friend Caroline Brewer was in Cusco at the moment. Caroline Brewer was an English friend who was often on our trivia teams, but she was also a highly qualified physiotherapist. In fact, she was the first female physiotherapist on an FA Cup winning football team, Wimbledon in 1988. She was also the first qualified female soccer referee in the UK in 1976. She asked a few questions and gave me some soothing words of comfort, which I really needed on that particular day. Can I move my leg? Yes. Did I feel something crack when I crashed to the ground? No. Well, she said, you've probably not broken any bones. You just have to rest and wait. Then she even went and bought a pair of crutches for me because up until that time I was using my camera tripod as a crutch to get around. Remember my friend Christo with the coca shop? When I told him about my accident, he wasn't surprised at all. He said there's many accidents on that street, and there's a local legend going around that it's got an Inca curse on it because of something that happened to him and his wife Suneko in his little blue and white combi van. In his case, the brakes failed, the passenger door flew open, and his wife and the seat fell out in the street.
No way. Same street accident? Yes, I'm sure there's an Inca curse, huh? It's just calle de piedras, not paved road. That's very steep. No, my brakes didn't work, I fixed the brakes the day before, and all of a sudden I was without brake going straight into a wall. We were without seatbelt. Her door, the co-pilot door got opened. So I pushed Suneko out of the car, and she fell with the seat. And then I managed with the driving wheel to stop it,
Now, I don't know if I believe in any Inca curse, but it is rather strange that both me and Christo in the same place felt like something took control of the steering and caused us to have an accident. I was on crutches for 3 weeks. For the first 10 days, nothing seemed to be improving and I was getting more and more worried. I started going on walks, getting out and about with the crutches, and then after about 10 days until the end of the 3 weeks, I went a little bit further each day and didn't hurt as much until one day I could actually walk all the way up to the Plaza de Armas without any crutches. You can see here I certainly didn't starve to death with Jane bringing food and other people. I put on a lot of weight with the lack of exercise and all those pizzas people were bringing me. It's times like this that you realise how fortunate you are to have your health and mobility, and how there's always someone worse off than you. Like this poor guy that I saw in the Plaza de Armas. I think he was blind. He had a little note around his neck asking for donations. Limosna is like alms, money for the poor. Now Cusco's a tourist town and they can spot gringos a mile away and they often see you as a cash cow. But I noticed a change in people's attitudes when I was out with crutches. Taxi drivers would give me a discount, people were much friendlier, and I distinctly remember one day walking across the road, I saw a one-legged beggar across the road, and he was smiling at me, and he went like this, "Hola jefe," which means, "Hi chief." And that kind of struck a chord with me. I had descended into the world of the Cusco cripples, and I was one of them. It was a very humbling experience, and it made me realise just how lucky you are to have your mobility. Bikers kept coming to La Estrelita, usually heading south for the summer, so they could get down to Patagonia when the weather was good. This guy's called Josh Fowler. He had ridden all the way from Florida, Central America, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, without incident, and he was heading down to Brazil via Puerto Maldonado on his Suzuki 650. I saw some funny things during this period of not being very mobile. One day I was walking past this church, which is actually the oldest church in Cusco, Iglesia de Triunfo, and I saw these guys working with, it looked like plastering mud on the stonework. So I took a few snaps, put it on my blog, and lo and behold, the photo went viral. It built up and up over the years. Now there's hundreds of people that have just sort of stolen that photo off me, never given me credit, used it in advertisements even. Put like funny names on it, but it's not as it appears actually, that photo. Those men aren't holding the ropes, they're guiding him, but it's securely held further back, but you can't see it from the ground. So all these memes that use that saying, these guys are working dangerously, these guys, didn't finish the job because they died in an accident, all those kind of jokes, they're not true. That photo and a few others were ripped off, and that's one of the reasons I stopped doing my blog after a while. I love playing around with GPS units. I actually came with 3, or 4 if you count the one that's built into that little Pentax camera. And one day we did a test here in the La Estrelita. We left them on a board facing the sky for half an hour so they could have plenty of time to calculate the altitude. but the results were all over the place. The differences came out to 179 metres, which is almost 600 feet. And interestingly, even the identical models there, the HCX Vistas, which supposedly had barometric altimeters built in, varied by about 100 feet. I carried spare GPS, but this Swiss biker carried lots of spare tyres. He heard that tyres for big European bikes were hard to get, and they can be, but not that hard that you really have to carry 3 of them, I don't think. So after 3 weeks, I didn't need the crutches anymore, but I was still hesitant about getting back on a motorbike. I mean, everybody knows someone who's been injured or killed in a motorbike. Think of Lawrence of Arabia, survived all those wars only to die on a motorbike in the back of an English country lane. Think of Pete Conrad, astronaut, 3rd man to walk on the moon, died on a motorbike. I remember when I was at high school, we had a teacher who lost an arm in a motorbike accident that didn't even damage his motorbike. So anyone who says they're not dangerous, well, I'm not one of them. But something inside me was saying, do it, do it. Get up and do it. If you don't do it now, you'll never do it. Including a man that I admire a lot, my friend John Livers. So I decided to go back to Arica to do a visa run, retrieve some luggage I left there, and just think about it for a while. The journey's about 1,000 kilometres and can take more than a day depending on the connections that you get. Here you can see they video every passenger as he gets on the bus. 1, in case one of them is a thief, and 2, in case there's a terrible mountain accident, which they have many of here in the Andes, and they need to identify the bodies. Entering Chile from Peru, you see this huge billboard. I think it serves 2 purposes. 1, as a recruitment poster, and secondly, to remind Peruvians they have a pretty potent military force. Because not many people know, Peru and Chile don't get on. The border is demarked with landmines and has been for years. And this ongoing tension sells a lot of sensational newspapers, especially in Peru. Just read this one. I only spent 2 days in Arica, just enough time to see these shops with pirate and hippie themes. You see these signs, and I'm on my way back up to Cusco. And you go over 4,400 metres on that road, which is over 1,000 metres higher than Cusco, which is pretty high. A lot higher than the highest mountain in Australia, which is only 2,000 something metres. By the way, you might ask why this video quality is so bad. Well, it's because the only camera I had on me at the time was my little pocket camera, and that was the video that it output. And this is the only time, before or since, I ever saw the municipality guards patrolling on segways. Summer brings rain in Cusco, and it often falls as hail. My hostel was only a few blocks from Huayna Capac Street, which is where all the motorbike sales and service centres are, in that one block. They literally assemble brand new Chinese bikes on the side of the street. Often they come in crates in fully knocked down kits from China, and they just whip them together in an hour or 2. Many of the Chinese brands you've never heard of. And sometimes they add an English word or 2 to add a bit of prestige. These tuk-tuks are actually banned in Cusco because the streets are too steep and they don't have good enough brakes. But they sell like hotcakes, and they use them in other towns around Peru. More established brands like Honda and KTM are seen in Cusco occasionally, but you have to look closely. This says RTM, not KTM, a complete rip-off. Japan technology, again, that's in English, and we're in a Spanish-speaking country. It's ambiguous, and it's put there to confuse the poor old consumer from Peru. He doesn't know whether it's really Japanese or Chinese, he just sees that there. See, it says here, made for Europe. Well, again, that's confusing consumers because for looks like por in Spanish, and made por Europe means made in Europe or made by Europe. So again, it's kind of a little bit deceptive advertising. Japanese technology of Japan, standard of Japan, they put all these things on these Chinese bikes just to fool people. Some of the brand names would raise a few eyebrows in English-speaking countries. The Wanxin. How about the Spanker 200? Now this Rocker 150 has lots of luggage racks and spaces. It also has a built-in MP3 player and waterproof speakers on the handlebar. But it's all a gimmick. That's not really what I was looking for. This Forte looked okay. This military style one, it wasn't really military. The only thing sort of different about it was the plastic fuel tank was bigger than a normal one. You soon notice the most popular style of bike are the enduro, or they say dos caminos, 2 roads, like on-road, off-road. And that makes sense because it's a lot of farming communities here. There are still villages not so far from Cusco that you can only get there by motorbike or donkey, horse. Your cars can't get there because they're so narrow and steep. So it makes sense to have these kind of motorbikes. I did consider buying a Bajaj because I'd seen them in India and they are kind of in between Chinese and Japanese quality, but you know, a good all-round bike. But they didn't have an enduro style there at the time I was looking to buy, so I couldn't get one of those. But I did see this bike, the Dayang Bullet, which does look a lot like a Bajaj. And then I saw a Yamaha Lander for only $1,200. Yamaha Landers, made in Brazil since 2006 with fuel injection, they go for $6,000 or $7,000. It's not a Yamaha Lander. This was a Chinese bike that used the same name. Now this brand is pronounced in Spanish Kinky. Now Kinky bikes are one of the more expensive and they have a pretty good reputation amongst the Chinese bikes, but they had their own sort of unique engine and all the parts were different from the other generic bikes. So, you know, I didn't really like the fact that that was a one-off kind of bike. And who knows, outside of Peru, would you be able to get parts for a Chinese Kinky bike? Then I saw this one, Ronco. Now this one here is a 250cc and it's called the Demolition model, Demolition 250. It had inverted forks, it had rear disc brakes, it had electric start and kick start. It had luggage racks. It was enduro. It had a 1-year guarantee and it had a generic Shine Ray engine, itself supposedly a copy of an earlier Honda engine. So I'm thinking maybe parts would be easier to get for this model. And I liked the look of it. Then I met this couple who owned a farm somewhere outside of Cusco and they arrived on a Ronco for servicing and they said they had no problems whatsoever with their bike and it carried 2 passengers. I went in, talked to the sales lady, Adelina. She assured me that foreigners could buy these bikes, register them. She sold one to a Spaniard not long ago who went to Bolivia and came back, she said. The price was right, only like $1,700 US. It looked good on paper. It had more than 20 horsepower, 5-speed transmission. I could get it in orange. That was a special order. You had to pay a deposit to get that. But within 4 days, she said, it would be here, delivered on a truck from Lima if I paid the deposit. But it was also one of the most expensive of the Chinese bikes. But then again, just say it was $1,500. A brand new Honda would end up costing you around $7,500 back then. So you could buy 5 of these Chinese motorbikes for the price of one Japanese bike. A lot of bikers tour on these big European bikes, especially BMWs. But with the import taxes and everything, in Peru you can pay over $30,000 for one of those. And with insurance and maintenance and everything, it becomes very expensive. I could buy 24 Chinese bikes for that amount of money. There's also the problem that the little country town bush mechanic, he doesn't know how to work on these electronic injected BMWs. And if I lose it in an accident or stolen, that's a lot of money down the drain. In fact, just the depreciation on a new bike like that would pay for a couple of Chinese bikes. And then there's the fact that everybody sees you, thinks you're a millionaire and trying to get bribes and rip you off and overcharge you. So, no thanks. And they're very heavy if they fall over. I went back to my hostel and just talked to a few people, but not everybody was supportive of my idea to get back on a motorbike. This is Ruben Bravo, one of the owners of the hostel, who actually carried me up to my room when I had the bike accident, a month previously.
Oh, Klein, no compres moto, porque quien compra moto, compra un cajón para sepultarse en el cementerio.
This is Carlos. He was a Colombian from Medellin who had ridden a bicycle all the way from there to here and was continuing down to Patagonia. He also co-authored this folkloric photo essay book. He made a living by making these little wooden toys which he sold on the street. And when he had enough money, he would continue cycling to the next town.
Te cuento, hermano, en Medellín, la sala de emergencias del hospital más grande de la ciudad, la sala de emergencias donde llegan todos los heridos de carros, balaceras, accidentes de moto, en fin, esa sala la pusieron Kawasaki, por todos los que llegaban de motos allá a la ciudad. La sala Kawasaki. Dice que las motos son la venganza japonesa. Así que esté pilas, hermano.
And remember my friend Ashley from a previous episode who rode a BMW from Alaska to Patagonia? Well, he was supportive of me buying a bike an off-road bike, but not a Chinese bike. He said, some of them are cheap due to cheap suspension, brakes, tyres, etc. And he also said, seriously, Glenn, I think you'll regret your decision every time you swing your leg over the seat. So I kept thinking, but I had to make a decision soon. If I was going to head south to Patagonia, which was my objective, I had to leave soon because it was already December, the middle of summer, and you can only really go down to Patagonia in like a 3-month window because it's so cold and the roads ice over. It's just dangerous to go any later in the year. Meanwhile, cyclists and motorbikers of all descriptions were coming and going from La Estrelita, but this particular bike rider was not allowed to stay because he had a pet dog in the back. You could see it there. And the dogs would chase the chickens that were out the back that provided eggs for the free breakfast at the hostel, so he wasn't allowed to stay. This fellow rode his bicycle all the way from Brazil, and he made a living in the Plaza de Armas, waving his Brazilian flag, and Brazilian tourists would come over, talk to him, and he'd charge them $1 or $2 to get their photo taken with him, and that's how he made a living. This is Jerome from France, and he set me in my place when I said, where did you ride from? He said, France. And I said, but where did you begin your trip? France. And he explained he rode from France down to Spain, down to Morocco, got a boat across to the French Caribbean, then rode from French Guiana down through Brazil and then up the back way here to Peru, to Cusco. And he did it on this recumbent bicycle. I'd only ever seen photos of them before, and very amazing.
Si un día te vas en Francia, lo sé. Mi casa es tu casa.
Ah, gracias, viejo.
I then saw with my own eyes, on 2 wheels, you can carry 2 to 3 times more than you can as a backpacker. Just the amount of luggage you can carry. I don't know how you balance them, but apparently you get used to it. This is Len McDonald on his big BMW. I helped him on a telephone call to order a tyre for his bike, and the price was astronomical.
Good luck, man.
This is Sean Galanos and Dan Jones. Now Dan began somewhere in the Midwest, rode up to the Arctic Circle and then was heading straight down to Patagonia. Now these guys look like a bunch of hardcore, experienced, long distance bike riders. So I asked Sean, what did he think about buying a Chinese bike?
So that bike I was looking at, what do you think?
It's a great looking bike. You know, if it's between taking a bus and riding a Chinese motorcycle, I'd take a Chinese motorcycle any day. I rode a bus for 15 minutes and it made me realize just why I travel on a motorcycle. So Chinese bikes, buy 3 of them for the price of 1. You know, they're disposable, they look great. And yeah, as long as you're on a motorcycle, that's all that matters.
Later on, I checked Sean's blog entries. He had a blog running on Adventure Rider, and he had his fair share of mechanical, electrical problems with his KTM. Dan made it down to Ushuaia in Patagonia, and he wrote this little book about it. Now 3 things were racing through my head. Envy, anticipation, excitement. I was in the wrong place, the wrong hostel for someone who was hesitant about buying a motorbike. Everybody was coming and going, everybody was having fun. I had to just bite the bullet. Actually, it was the perfect time to buy a motorbike because the Australian dollar was worth 10% more than the American dollar for the first time in 30 years. So a couple of trips to the ATM machine, put my 500 soles down, deposit on a brand new orange Ronco Demolition 250. Viene con casco y...
Le voy a dar su casco, como a todos los clientes que se le da, su casco, sus guantes,
sí.
Y viene un estuchito de jersey.
Ok, gracias.
Y su DNI, número de su pasaporte.
Ah, esos son mi apellido. En inglés no uso apellido de madre, solo apellido de padre. ¿Ven, David?
Y apellido madre.
No está en mi pasaporte. No lo usamos en inglés, pero si quieres...
No, normal.
Ok, gracias. ¿Y cuándo vienen las placas? En 2 semanas.
2 semanas, 15 días. Aquí,
¿Pero viene aquí o por mi hostel? Ven acá. Ok, gracias. So it was only 3 or 4 days later, it arrived in a box on a truck from Lima. It was a rainy day, but like all the other bikes in Cusco, it got assembled on the street there. I was a bit worried with the altitude it wouldn't start, but on the second cranking, started no problems. There was one small problem. It came with black instead of orange plastic tank air scoops, but I would get them later on.
¿Todo bien?
Willie the mechanic took it on a test ride.
¿Todo bien?
So I was about to turn 50 years old. This is the first new vehicle I'd ever owned in my life, delivered to the hostel. I was so excited. Look at that, 2.1 kilometers. I had no idea how long this journey would last. I was thinking maybe 10 months and maybe 15,000 kilometers. I wasn't sure what was in store for me, but there was a lot in store for me, I can tell you. Coming up in the next episode, some modifications are made to the bike. We spend Christmas and New Year's Eve in Cusco. We get to see a little bit of Peruvian culture, go on my first few rides on the bike. The bike gets a name and it gets blessed by a Catholic priest. And Angelo takes me on a ride to a supposed haunted house.
Gringo Loco asks,
hit the subscribe button.
Please subscribe.